She ran away from her father but was already pregnant by him. A secret that for decades remained buried in the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, in a community as isolated as the very souls who inhabited it. This is the story of Martha Holloway, a young woman whose destiny was sealed even before her birth, on a family line where the borders of kinship had been obscured by generations. Our report begins in 1952, when the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri housed hundreds of isolated communities, many of them virtually disconnected from the rest of a modernizing America. In one of these forgotten valleys, approximately 40 kilometers from Branson, there was a property known locally as the Holloway Clearing. There, 3 generations of the Holloway family had built a practically self-sufficient existence with little contact with the outside world. The 200-acre property was led by Samuel Holloway, a 43-year-old widowed man for 5 years after his wife Elizabeth passed away during the birth of their 6th son, who also did not survive. Samuel was described by rare visitors as an imposing man, with a thick beard and gray eyes that rarely showed emotion. His word was law on the property where he lived with his 5 surviving children. What few knew was that the Holloway family was already carrying the burden of several generations of marriage between cousins. Samuel himself was the son of first cousins, as was his late wife. This pattern, which had begun as a way of maintaining land and goods within the family during the region's colonization in the 19th century, had become a rarely questioned custom even when signs of genetic problems began to manifest. Among Samuel's sons, the 16-year-old Martha was considered the most beautiful and healthy. With a petite stature, long brown hair, and deep blue eyes that contrasted with her light skin, Martha showed an intelligence and liveliness that seemed to have escaped the genetic fate beginning to manifest in her younger brothers. John, 14, had severe learning difficulties. Thomas, 12, suffered from a spinal malformation that limited his movements. Rebecca, 10, seemed normal but rarely spoke. And the youngest, Elijah, 8, was born with fused fingers, a condition that limited his dexterity. The family's isolation was not only geographical but also cultural and social. The Holloway children received their education at home, taught by Samuel himself, who had studied up to the high school equivalent. The religion practiced was a version of Christianity with Samuel as the supreme interpreter of the scriptures. Contact with the outside world was limited to Samuel's monthly trips to the city for supplies they could not produce, and rare family visits to the local church for Easter and Christmas celebrations. In April 1952, however, this isolated balance was disturbed when the local Reverend Robert McKinthey managed to convince Samuel to allow Martha to participate in the church's youth activities, arguing that the young woman needed appropriate female company for her age. Reluctantly, Samuel gave in, possibly out of respect for religious authority, or perhaps because he saw in Martha a possible connection with some respectable regional family that could bring new opportunities. For the next 2 months, Martha experienced her first glimpse of the world beyond the Holloways. In Sunday activities, she met other young women, learned songs, participated in picnics, and, most importantly, was presented with ideas and values different from those imposed by her father. It was through these interactions that Martha began to realize there was something deeply disturbing in her own family. In June 1952, Martha confided a concern that plagued her to Sarah Bennett, the Reverend's wife. "Sometimes when my dad returns from town, he looks at me in a way that gives me goosebumps," said Martha. "It's like he's seeing me, but not as a daughter." Sarah, worried, asked if Samuel had done anything inappropriate, to which Martha responded only with silence and tears. Sarah promised to talk to the Reverend about it. The following Sunday, however, Samuel reported that Martha could no longer participate in church activities, claiming she had many responsibilities at home. When Reverend McKinthey visited the property to try to intervene, he was received with a shotgun and the order to never set foot on Holloway lands again. During the following weeks, the nearest residents reported hearing shouts from the Holloway property at night. In mid-July, the eldest son of the nearest neighbor, while hunting, saw Martha alone washing clothes in the stream that cut through the property. He noticed bruises on her arms and a downcast countenance that contrasted with the liveliness she had demonstrated in the church activities. In late July, during a particularly violent storm, Martha Holloway disappeared from the family property. Samuel Holloway appeared in town the next morning, visibly disturbed, asking if anyone had seen his daughter. An informal search was organized, but no sign of Martha was found nearby. Samuel publicly accused Reverend McKinley of filling the girl's head with dangerous ideas and possibly assisting in her escape, accusations vehemently denied by the religious man. The truth would only begin to emerge 2 weeks later when Martha was found passed out on the edge of a road more than 80 kilometers away, outside Springfield. Taken to the local hospital, the young woman was dehydrated, malnourished, and, as the doctors soon discovered, approximately 2 months pregnant. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Martha's story reveals family secrets that the system tried to bury for decades. Only here will you have access to never-before-revealed details about real cases that the authorities preferred to forget. When Martha Holloway regained consciousness at Springfield Hospital in August 1952, she initially refused to provide any information beyond her name. The social worker assigned to the case, Eleanor Thompson, a 37-year-old known for her patience and compassion, spent days building a relationship of trust with the traumatized young woman. Martha was like an injured animal, Eleanor would recall years later in her personal diary, which only became public in 1998 after her death. Her eyes were constantly alert, looking for dangers. She cringed at the slightest noise. It took a week until she allowed me to sit next to her bed without trembling. Meanwhile, the authorities were able to identify Martha's family through fragmented school records and the testimony of Reverend McKinley. When informed of his daughter's whereabouts, Samuel Holloway immediately demanded her release and return to family custody, citing his right as a father and legal guardian. It was during the second week of hospitalization that Martha finally began to share her story with Eleanor, in reports interspersed with crying fits and long silences. Martha revealed the horror she had lived in the months before her escape. "After I stopped going to church, Dad started to lock me in the basement when visitors arrived," said Martha. "He told my brothers that I was sick. At night, after everyone slept." At this point, as recorded by Eleanor, Martha often interrupted her report, unable to verbalize the events. Over the days, the full picture emerged. Samuel had begun to visit Martha's room at night, initially just to watch her, according to the young woman. These episodes evolved into forced intimate contact, always accompanied by threats of punishment to the younger brothers if she resisted or told anyone. He said that this was how families kept the purity of blood, Martha told the social worker. "My own mother had been not only my mother, but also my aunt, and that it was normal in the families of the mountains." The most disturbing revelation came when Martha explained why she had fled that particular July night. "I heard Dad talking to Uncle Jeremiah about marrying me to my cousin Walter when he returned from the army. Walter is Uncle Jeremiah's son with Aunt Catherine, who was my mother's sister. I knew I would never get out of that cycle again." Martha had planned her escape for weeks, hiding small amounts of food and keeping the few cents she got when her father wasn't looking. On the night of the storm, when the family's attention was focused on protecting the property against possible floods, she escaped through her bedroom window with only the clothes on her body and a small bundle containing her most basic belongings. "I walked for days, sleeping in barns and hiding when I thought it was safe," she said. "I just wanted to get to a place where no one knew me, where I could start over." The case of Martha Holloway presented a complex legal and ethical dilemma for the 1952 authorities. On one hand, there were extremely serious accusations against Samuel, which, if proven, constituted heinous crimes. On the other hand, there was the social stigma involving issues of family intimacy, something rarely discussed openly at that time, especially in conservative rural communities. District Prosecutor Howard Jenkins, a middle-aged pragmatic man known for his discretion, initially opted for a cautious approach. Instead of immediately filing criminal accusations against Samuel Holloway, which would be difficult to prove without physical evidence beyond Martha's testimony, Jenkins requested that Judge William Cuthus issue a temporary protection order, preventing Samuel from having any contact with his daughter. Judge Cuthus, a 62-year-old man known for his traditional stance on family issues, surprised many by granting not only the protection order but also by ordering a broader investigation into the living conditions of Samuel Holloway's other children. The charges made by the minor Martha Holloway are so serious in nature that this court cannot ignore the possibility that other minors residing on the Holloway property may be at risk, the judge wrote in his decision of August 28, 1952. The subsequent investigation revealed a generational pattern of consanguineous relationships in the Holloway family dating back to at least 4 generations. Parish records and birth certificates showed multiple marriages between first- and second-degree cousins, and in at least 2 previous cases, relationships between uncle and niece had been formalized through counterfeit weddings. Dr. Harold Winters, a physician designated to examine Martha's brothers, documented a series of conditions he attributed to the effects of prolonged consanguinity. The 4 minors have signs consistent with recurring genetic problems in consanguineous lineages, including cognitive disabilities, physical malformations, and atypical development. A clear danger for any future offspring. While the investigation continued, Martha remained under state care, initially in the hospital and later in a temporary home administered by Catholic nuns around Springfield. It was there, in September 1952, that Martha tried to take her own life upon discovering her pregnancy had been confirmed beyond any doubt. She ingested a significant amount of cleaning products, said Sister Mary Catherine, the home supervisor. When we found her, she repeated that she couldn't bring another deformed creature into the world, that the blood was contaminated and it would be better for everyone if it ended there. After the suicide attempt, Martha was transferred to a psychiatric institution in St. Louis, where she remained under constant observation. Doctors debated intensely about how to proceed with the pregnancy. In 1952, the intentional termination of pregnancy was not only illegal in most circumstances but also considered morally unacceptable by much of society, even in extreme cases like Martha's. Dr. Lawrence Friedman, the chief psychiatrist responsible for the case, described in his notes the ethical dilemma he faced. The patient is clearly traumatized by the prospect of carrying a pregnancy resulting from improper relationships with her own parent. The risk of another self-harm attempt is significant. Perhaps termination would better serve the patient's immediate psychological well-being. While Martha struggled with her reality in the psychiatric institution, Samuel Holloway finally faced the legal consequences of his actions. On October 5, 1952, after weeks of investigation, Prosecutor Howard Jenkins presented formal charges against Samuel, including child abuse, parental neglect, and improper conduct under the tutelage, legal terms of the time that avoided explicit language about the actual nature of the crimes. The local community reacted with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and, in some cases, defense of the accused. Samuel has always been a reserved man, but hardworking and God-fearing, a neighbor told the local newspaper. These accusations must be a misunderstanding. Others, however, especially women in the community, expressed that they had always noticed something disturbing in the Holloway family dynamics. "Those children never smiled," commented one of the ladies of the church. And Martha, when she started coming on Sundays, looked like a flower blooming in the sun for the first time. There was a hunger in her eyes, not for food, but for something she never had. The winter of 1952 to 1953 was particularly harsh in the Ozark Mountains. As snow covered the hills and valleys, further isolating rural communities, 3 parallel dramas unfolded involving the Holloway family members. At the St. Louis Psychiatric Institution, Martha Holloway, now 17 years old and in her 4th month of pregnancy, alternated between periods of deep depression and moments of unexpected clarity and determination. The medical team had managed to stabilize her emotional state enough that the young woman no longer posed an immediate danger to herself, but the underlying trauma remained largely untouched. During therapy sessions, Martha began to express concern not only for her own future but also for the fate of her brothers, wrote Dr. Friedman in January 1953. It is remarkable how, despite everything she suffered, she maintains a strong sense of responsibility for the younger siblings. Dr. Elena Blackwell, one of the few female psychiatrists in Missouri at that time, gradually assumed leadership of Martha's treatment. Under her care, the young woman began to process her trauma through occupational therapy and art therapy, activities considered innovative for the time. Martha demonstrates a remarkable aptitude for drawing, said Dr. Blackwell. Her first drawings portrayed exclusively claustrophobic scenes, dark basements, locked windows, dense and dead forests. In recent weeks, however, images of open doors and paths extending beyond the horizon have begun to emerge. In mid-January, a significant advance occurred when Martha expressed for the first time curiosity about the development of the baby she carried. She asked if the child would necessarily be born with problems, if there was any chance it could be normal, despite the circumstances of its conception, said Dr. Blackwell. I explained in the most honest and compassionate way possible that while the risk of genetic complications was greater due to consanguinity, it was not an absolute certainty. While Martha slowly rebuilt some sense of hope in St. Louis, the situation of her brothers had become the object of intense legal and social debate. Following Samuel Holloway's arrest, the 4 minors were temporarily placed under the care of different foster families, a decision the Child Welfare Department justified as necessary to properly assess each child's specific needs. John, the eldest of the brothers at 14, was placed with the Patterson family, Methodist farmers with experience welcoming children with learning difficulties. Thomas, 12, due to his physical condition, was allocated to the Williams family, where the father was a nurse and could assist in his specific care. Rebecca, 10, initially remained with the family of Reverend McKinthey, who felt particularly responsible for the fate of the Holloway children. The youngest, Elijah, 8, was welcomed by the Coopers, a childless couple who had recently completed training for adoptive parents. The children's adaptation to these new environments was, as expected, challenging. The minors show behaviors consistent with prolonged social isolation and exposure to traumatic family dynamics, social worker Marian Hendrick said in her December 1952 follow-up report. Particularly remarkable is the tendency of the 4 siblings to communicate with each other through gestures and expressions that appear to constitute their own language, possibly developed as a protection mechanism. Rebecca, the 10-year-old sister who rarely spoke, surprised everyone when, after 6 weeks at the McKinthey house, she began to communicate verbally, not with adults, but with the Reverend's daughter, a girl of a similar age. Mrs. McKinthey reported hearing the girls talking in their shared room, with Rebecca describing in disturbing detail that special games that her father made Martha play when he thought the other children were sleeping. These additional revelations, although transmitted through a child's indirect witness, served to further strengthen the case against Samuel Holloway, whose trial was scheduled for March 1953. Samuel, in turn, remained in the county jail, refusing to admit any irregularity and insisting that his family practices were protected by religious freedom and the natural right of a father to rule his own home. He found an unlikely ally in his state-designated lawyer, Clayton Morris, an extremely religious man who, although personally disgusted by the accusations, firmly believed in the constitutional right of defense for all accused. My client categorically refutes the allegations presented and maintains that his actions have always been guided by his family's welfare, Morris told the local press. We question the reliability of the testimony of an emotionally disturbed teenager and the legality of the way the children were removed from the family residence. A third drama unfolded on the Holloway property itself, now abandoned and under continuous investigation. In January 1953, during a thorough search of the premises, authorities discovered a hidden compartment under the floor of the main house containing family documents dating back to 1865. Among these documents was a diary belonging to Josiah Holloway, Samuel's great-grandfather and the original family patriarch in the region. The diary entries, written between 1865 and 1883, revealed a disturbing philosophy that had apparently guided family practices for generations. The outer world is contaminated, but we Holloways will keep our blood pure, Josiah wrote in 1872. Every union with strangers dilutes our essence. Each marriage within the family strengthens our legacy. This is how we survive when others fail. Other entries described how Josiah had gradually isolated his family from contact with the wider community, establishing a belief system that mixed distorted Bible interpretations with popular pseudoscientific theories of the late 19th century. A particularly revealing entry dated 1879 described how Josiah had arranged the marriage of his eldest daughter, then 14 years old, to her own younger brother, the girl's uncle. Elizabeth initially resisted, as expected of her stubborn nature. After 3 weeks in the basement of the healing house, she finally accepted the divine will and her responsibility to the purity of our lineage. The discovery of these documents provided not only additional evidence against Samuel but also a broader historical context to understand how abusive practices had been perpetuated across generations, camouflaged under a facade of religious isolation and self-sufficiency. If you have ever felt your heart tighten thinking about the silent pain Martha carried, comment now. Martha deserves justice. This simple act shows that you see beyond appearances and recognize the suffering of those who cannot speak for themselves. On March 10, 1953, the trial of Samuel Holloway finally began at the county courthouse, an event that attracted attention not only from the local community but also from journalists from St. Louis and Kansas City. The case had gained regional notoriety, not so much for the specific details of the accusations, which the newspapers of the time treated with extreme caution and veiled language, but for what it represented in terms of the tension between isolationist family practices and evolving social and legal standards in the post-war era. Prosecutor Howard Jenkins, aware of the sensitivity of the case and the difficulties of obtaining convictions in cases involving intimate family relations at that time, built his argument around the most easily proven aspects of Samuel's behavior: the forced isolation of the children, the deprivation of adequate education, the unhealthy conditions of the property discovered during investigations, and the physical mistreatment documented by the doctors who examined the minors. Jenkins's strategy was complemented by testimonies from experts who contextualized the dangers of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Harold Winters, who had examined the younger brothers, presented photographic and medical evidence of the children's physical and cognitive conditions, which he directly attributed to the deleterious effects of reproduction within a restricted genetic group over multiple generations. Dr. Richard Montgomery, a geneticist from the University of Missouri invited as a specialized witness, explained to the jury in accessible terms how consanguinity dramatically increased the risk of manifestation of problematic genetic characteristics. When closely related people have children, the risks that the child inherits two copies of potentially harmful genes increase significantly. The chances of a negative outcome are much greater. Martha, still in an advanced stage of pregnancy, did not personally attend the court. Instead, her statement was filed in the form of a deposition previously recorded in the presence of a judge, the prosecutor, and the defense lawyer. The decision not to expose the young woman to the additional trauma of facing her father in court was taken after the express recommendation of Dr. Blackwell, who warned that such a confrontation could trigger a severe relapse in Martha's psychological state. Samuel's defense, in turn, focused on questioning the credibility of Martha's testimony and presenting the defendant as a strict but dedicated father whose practices of family isolation were motivated by sincere religious convictions and a desire to protect his children from the corrupting influence of modern society. The charges against my client represent nothing less than a criminalization of traditional family practices and religious beliefs that go back generations, argued Clayton Morris in his opening statement. Mr. Holloway raised his children the way he believed was correct, according to the values transmitted by his father and his father's father before him. Morris called as witnesses several members of the wider Ozark Mountains community who, although not intimately knowing the Holloway family, attested that family isolation and self-sufficiency were common and respected practices in the region, and that government interference in family affairs was traditionally viewed with distrust. The most controversial testimony came from Jeremiah Holloway, Samuel's brother and the children's uncle, who had been mentioned in Martha's report as an accomplice in the plan to marry her to her cousin. Jeremiah, a 41-year-old man notably similar to Samuel, denied any knowledge of improper behavior on his brother's part and described the Holloway family as reserved but decent. When questioned by the prosecutor about documented consanguineous marriages in the family history, including his own marriage to his first-degree cousin Catherine, Jeremiah responded with disturbing frankness. "Where I grew up, you marry who you know and who you trust. And who do you know better than your own family? Maybe in the city it seems strange, but in the mountains, it's just the way to survive." The trial lasted 7 days, during which the local community was divided into factions. While most expressed horror at the revelations about Holloway practices, a vocal minority defended Samuel's right to raise his family according to his own beliefs, seeing the case as an example of government interference in the family autonomy that many mountain inhabitants valued deeply. On March 17, 1953, after less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all charges. Judge Wilson, after hearing additional arguments from both sides on the appropriate sentence, sentenced Samuel Holloway to 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole before fulfilling at least 15 years. This court has rarely seen a case of abuse of parental authority so prolonged and systematic, Judge Wilson said as he pronounced the sentence. Although we recognize parents' rights to raise their children according to their religious beliefs, this right finds its absolute limits when it endangers the physical, mental, and moral well-being of the minors under their guardianship. The sentence was received with silent approval by most of those present in the court, including several members of the local religious community who had initially defended Samuel. Reverend McKinthey, who was present throughout the trial, later commented that the case had forced many in the community to confront a darkness we preferred to believe did not exist in our midst. While Samuel Holloway was taken to serve his sentence in the state penitentiary, a new chapter opened for Martha. On March 26, 1953, at 38 weeks of gestation, she went into labor at the St. Louis Hospital, accompanied by Dr. Blackwell, who had become her confidant and protector. After 14 hours of labor, Martha gave birth to a girl who, surprisingly, seemed to have no immediately apparent physical anomalies. Dr. Spencer Reynolds, a pediatrician who examined the newborn, observed with cautious optimism, "The child has normal reflexes. All fingers and extremities are present and well-formed, and there are no visible signs of facial or cranial abnormalities commonly associated with near consanguinity cases." However, some conditions may only manifest later in development. The question of the child's fate had been intensely debated during the previous months. Under normal circumstances of the time, a teenage single mother would be strongly pressured to give the baby up for adoption, especially considering the traumatic circumstances of conception. However, Dr. Blackwell had vehemently argued that forcing Martha to separate from her daughter against her will would constitute an unnecessary additional trauma. After observing the development of Martha's attitude towards the pregnancy, "I am convinced that she has developed a genuine bond with the child she carries," wrote Dr. Blackwell in her official recommendation to the family court. Separating mother and daughter at this moment would be adding another trauma to a young woman who has endured more than anyone should. With proper support, I believe Martha has the ability to be a loving and competent mother, turning a tragic circumstance into an opportunity for healing and redemption. The court, influenced by the recommendation of the respected psychiatrist and the unusual precedent of the case, granted Martha provisional custody of the newborn, whom she named Hope. Hope in peace, a name that reflected her vision for the future. In the weeks that followed Hope's birth, Martha was transferred to a transition house administered by a progressive religious organization in Jefferson City. The Uncommon program for the time was designed specifically to support young mothers in difficult circumstances, offering housing, continuing education, and professional training, allowing women to keep custody of their children as they worked to build independent lives. Martha demonstrates an impressive dedication to both her studies and the care of the baby, said Mrs. Patricia Donovan, the program's coordinator, in her April 1953 evaluation report. Despite her youth and the traumatic circumstances that brought her to us, she shows notable maturity and determination. In addition to her daughter's welfare, she remains concerned about the fate of her younger brothers. In fact, the situation of Martha's brothers had become a complex case for the social assistance system. After months of observation in temporary homes, detailed medical and psychological evaluations had been completed for each child, revealing a worrying picture of the effects of isolation and prolonged consanguinity. John, the eldest brother, was diagnosed with a moderate intellectual deficiency that significantly limited his capacity for academic learning, although he had surprising practical skills, particularly in carpentry and handcrafts. Thomas, whose spinal malformations were initially the most visible symptom, also had congenital heart problems that required corrective surgery. Rebecca, whose reluctance to speak was initially attributed to psychological trauma, was diagnosed with a specific form of partial hearing impairment that affected her ability to process certain vocal frequencies. Only Elijah, the youngest, despite the syndactyly fused fingers that affected his hands, seemed to have cognitive development close to normal for his age, although he had significant social backwardness. A case conference held in May 1953 brought together social workers, doctors, specialized educators, and court representatives to decide the long-term future of the Holloway children. The unanimous decision was that none of the children were able to return to the family property, even under the supervision of relatives, an option complicated by the fact that the investigation had revealed that virtually all adult Holloway relatives were implicated to a greater or lesser extent in the system of consanguineous marriage and social insulation. The minors John, Thomas, Rebecca, and Elijah Holloway require levels of specialized medical and educational intervention that would be impossible to ensure in a conventional family environment in their region of origin, the official report concluded. We recommend permanent placement in institutions that can meet their specific needs, with provisions to maintain contact between the siblings and their older sister, Martha. This recommendation, although formulated with the best intentions and based on professional assessments, reflected the predominant approach of the time for dealing with children with special needs, institutionalization. Such a decision would be widely revisited and criticized in the following decades as deinstitutionality and community integration became the preferred approaches. But in 1953, it seemed the most responsible option available. Martha reacted to the news with a mix of resignation and determination. She understands that her brothers need care she can't provide at the moment, said Dr. Blackwell after informing Martha of the decision, but she made me promise that they wouldn't be forgotten, that they would not disappear into some anonymous system. They were already invisible for too long, she said. In the following months, as Martha adapted to motherhood and continued her own recovery, she showed extraordinary resilience. She completed the equivalent of high school through an accelerated program, learned typographic and administrative skills, and began planning a future that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. In September 1953, a significant turnaround occurred in the case when a routine medical examination revealed that Hope had a subtle developmental delay, possibly indicative of underlying neurological problems. The doctors could not determine for sure if this was related to consanguinity or simply a variation of normal development, but the discovery affected Martha deeply. She spent 2 whole nights sleepless, just watching her daughter, said Mrs. Donovan. When she finally talked about it, Martha said something I will never forget: no matter what happens to Hope, she will never know what it is to be invisible or disposable. She will know she is loved just as she is. Martha's commitment to Hope's welfare, despite the traumatic circumstances of conception and potential developmental challenges, deeply impressed the professionals who worked with her. Dr. Reynolds, who continued to monitor Hope's development, observed in his notes, "I have rarely witnessed such an intense and healthy mother-daughter bond, especially considering the mother's youth and underlying trauma. Holloway seems to have the remarkable ability to completely separate the child from the circumstances of her conception." In November 1953, 9 months after Samuel Holloway's trial, an unexpected incident brought the case back to public attention. Jeremiah Holloway, Samuel's brother who had testified in his defense, was arrested after an investigation was triggered by his own wife, Catherine. Catherine, who had been hospitalized with serious injuries she initially reported as a fall, confided to a nurse that she had actually been assaulted by her husband after questioning his attention to their own daughter, Beth, 13. The nurse, alerted by the parallels with the recent Holloway case, notified the authorities. The subsequent investigation revealed that Beth Holloway showed signs of inappropriate intimate experiences, and the girl eventually confirmed that her father had begun to visit her at night after her Uncle Samuel's trial, telling her that now it was her responsibility to keep the family tradition alive. Jeremiah Holloway was arrested and charged with crimes similar to his brother's. During searches of his property, located approximately 10 kilometers from the original Holloway clearing, authorities discovered a collection of correspondence between Jeremiah and Samuel dating back decades, which explicitly documented how the family had systematically perpetuated practices of consanguinity for generations, justifying them through a distorted mixture of religiosity, pseudoscientific theories about blood purity, and a paranoid distrust of the outside world. The most disturbing letter, written by Samuel to Jeremiah just 3 months before Martha's escape, detailed, "I am preparing Martha to continue our pure lineage. She carries the best of our blood with few of the defects that affect the others. If Walter doesn't return from the army in time, it may be better for me to get the next generation started myself." These additional revelations not only retroactively strengthened the case against Samuel but also exposed the systematic extent of abusive practices within the Holloway clan, leading to a broader investigation that would eventually implicate 3 more adult members of the extended family in similar behaviors. For Martha, the news about her uncle brought complex feelings. She expressed both validation, because her testimony was fundamentally confirmed, and deep sadness for her cousin Beth, who now faced a trauma similar to hers. Dr. Blackwell reported that Martha specifically requested the opportunity to write a letter to Beth, saying that perhaps the only person who can really understand what she is going through is someone who has lived the same nightmare. Martha's letter to Beth, preserved in the case archives and later published with permission as part of a study on family trauma survivors, became a remarkable document for its compassion and wisdom beyond its author's years. Dear Beth, you don't know me, but we are cousins. More importantly, we are survivors of the same darkness. I want you to know 3 things that took me a long time to learn, but that changed everything for me. First, what happened was not your fault. Nothing you did or could have done caused or prevented it. Second, you are not contaminated or ruined. What they did to our bodies does not define who we are. And third, it is possible. A world where we get to decide who we will be. The summer of 1954 brought significant changes for Martha Holloway and her daughter Hope, now 15 months old. Thanks to her exceptional performance in Dr. Blackwell's transition program and the continuous support of the psychiatrist, who had become not only her therapist but also an informal mentor, Martha managed to get a job as an administrative assistant at a medical clinic in Columbia, Missouri. Far enough from the Ozark Mountains to offer a new beginning, but close enough to allow regular visits to her brothers. Martha demonstrates a remarkable ability to transform her traumatic experience into motivation to help others, said Dr. William Harrington, the clinic director who hired her. Her natural empathy, combined with her first-hand knowledge of system failures, makes her exceptionally effective in helping patients navigate complex social and medical services. Hope, while presenting mild developmental delays that required regular therapy, was a cheerful and affectionate child. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic, noting that many of the problems they initially feared had not manifested. While some subtle difficulties with fine motor coordination and sensory processing are present, the child demonstrates cognitive and emotional development within acceptable parameters for her age, said Dr. Reynolds in his June 1954 follow-up assessment. Martha had established a structured routine, dividing her time between work, Hope's care, and monthly visits to her brothers, who were housed in 2 different institutions, John and Thomas at the Hadley Institute for Special Needs, and Rebecca and Elijah at the Springfield State Center for Children's Rehabilitation. Although the institutions were more than 100 kilometers apart, Martha made a point of visiting both regularly, often traveling by bus for hours to spend a few precious hours with each pair of siblings. It is remarkable the effect that Martha's visits have on the behavior and emotional well-being of the Holloway children, said Dr. James Peterson, a psychologist at the Hadley Institute. John in particular, who usually demonstrates little emotional response to social interactions, completely transforms in the presence of his sister. His language becomes clearer, his affection more appropriate, and he displays a sense of humor that remains hidden in other circumstances. In October 1954, a significant event took place when Reverend McKinthey and his wife, who had kept in contact with Martha throughout the process, visited Columbia with an unexpected proposal. The couple, now in their 50s with adult children who had left home, offered to adopt Rebecca and Elijah, Martha's 2 younger brothers who presented the less severe medical challenges. After a lot of prayer and reflection, we have come to the conclusion that God is calling us to offer a home to these children, explained Reverend McKinthey to Martha during the meeting. We cannot undo what was done to them, but we can offer them a loving family and the care they deserve. The proposal put Martha in an emotionally complex position. On one hand, the opportunity to have her younger brothers in a genuinely loving family environment, instead of an institution, seemed an unexpected miracle. On the other hand, she felt a deep responsibility for all her brothers and was concerned that the separation from John and Thomas could be interpreted as abandonment. After weeks of intense conversations with Dr. Blackwell, additional visits to both institutions, and long discussions with the McKintheys about their expectations and commitments, Martha finally gave her support to the adoption. The most important thing to me is that they know that they are still my brothers, that we are still a family, just organized in a different way now, she explained to the McKintheys. The adoption process, which began in November 1954, faced significant bureaucratic challenges, partly due to the high-profile case associated with the children and partly due to the institutional policies of the time that often discouraged the adoption of children with special needs. However, with the support of several professionals who had worked on the Holloway case, including Judge Corthus and Dr. Blackwell herself, the process advanced. In April 1955, the court finally approved the adoption of Rebecca and Elijah by the McKintheys, with the specified condition that Martha would maintain regular visitation rights. The McKintheys, demonstrating a remarkably progressive understanding for the time, not only accepted this condition but actively embraced it, recognizing the vital role Martha played in her brothers' emotional lives. "We are not replacing Martha as a familial figure," Mrs. McKinthey explained during the final adoption hearing. "We are just expanding the circle of love and support around these children who have already suffered more than any child should." The transition of Rebecca and Elijah to the McKinthey house occurred gradually throughout the summer of 1955, with initial visits followed by weekend stays and finally a permanent change in August. Martha actively participated in the process, working with therapists and educators to ensure the transition was as non-traumatic as possible. John and Thomas, meanwhile, remained at the Hadley Institute, where they continued to receive the specialized treatment their conditions demanded. John, now 17, had developed considerable joinery skills under the guidance of a patient instructor, creating surprisingly intricate and beautiful wooden pieces despite his cognitive limitations. Thomas, 15, had undergone 2 corrective surgeries for his spinal condition and, although still facing significant mobility challenges, showed consistent progress in his physical rehabilitation. Martha continued to visit them faithfully, taking Hope with her to ensure the girl knew her uncles from an early age. "It is important to me that Hope grows up understanding that family is not defined by what seems normal to others, but by love and commitment," Martha explained to Dr. Blackwell during one of her less frequent sessions, now performed more as well-being checks than as intensive care. In November 1955, an unexpected development occurred when Martha received a letter from Samuel Holloway, sent from the state prison where he was serving his sentence. It was Samuel's first attempt to communicate since his conviction, and the content of the letter revealed a mind still unable to fully recognize the nature of his crimes. "My dear Martha, I hope this letter finds you sorry and seeking the forgiveness that only a father can grant. I have prayed for your soul and for the child born of our pure blood. The world will try to convince you that what we had was wrong, but you and I know the truth about our special mission. When I am released, we will rebuild our family as it should be. Lovingly, Samuel Holloway." Martha, deeply disturbed by the letter, immediately handed it over to the authorities and requested a formal restraining order, which was promptly granted. The incident, although distressing, served as a clear reminder of how much she had progressed in her own recovery. The letter that only 2 years earlier could have sent her into a spiral of anxiety and fear now caused a calm determination to protect her new life and that of her daughter, Dr. Blackwell noted. "He still believes he has power over me," Martha told Dr. Blackwell after the incident. "But the truth is, he has no place in my life. He is just a reminder of what I overcame." In late 1955, as Martha approached her 20th birthday, she made a significant decision to change her last name and that of Hope legally, abandoning the name Holloway and its traumatic associations. After careful consideration, she chose the last name Freeman, a name that symbolized not only her liberation from the past but also her vision for the future. "Martha Freeman has a good sound," she commented during the simple legal procedure that made the change official. "It's a name that Hope and I can carry proudly." The following years brought gradual stability and consistent achievements. Martha continued to progress in her career, eventually becoming coordinator of social services at the clinic, a position that allowed her to help other families in crisis. Hope, while continuing to face some mild cognitive challenges, developed into a happy and socially well-adjusted child with a particular talent for music and art. Rebecca and Elijah flourished in the loving environment of the McKinthey household, each progressing beyond the initial expectations of doctors. Rebecca, whose partial hearing was eventually corrected with then experimental technology, developed a love for literature and writing, often creating elaborate stories to entertain her younger brother. Elijah, after corrective surgery to separate some of his fused fingers, revealed a talent for technical design that would eventually lead to a career in architectural drafting. John and Thomas, although they remained institutionalized due to their more complex needs, also found ways to develop their own strengths and talents within the limitations of their conditions. Martha never failed to visit them, keeping the family bond alive even when others might have considered it a closed chapter. In 1962, 10 years after the escape that changed the course of her life, Martha Freeman, now 26, was invited to share her story at a conference on the prevention of child abuse, one of the first events of its kind in America. Her carefully anonymized testimony, to protect her privacy and that of Hope, had a profound impact on the professionals present. A terrible part of my family's history was not only what happened within those isolated walls, she concluded in her speech. It was also the silence of the surrounding community, the eyes that looked away, the ears that refused to hear the signs. When we protect the right of families to completely isolate themselves from social scrutiny, we are not protecting freedom. We are potentially protecting abuse. Children are not property. They are human beings with the right to security, dignity, and the chance of a future beyond the shadows of their ancestors. The Ozark Mountains, with their deep valleys and dense forests, still keep many secrets of families who for generations lived in isolation. The history of the Holloways, though particularly tragic, was not unique. Other families in isolated communities across the country have continued similar practices, often under the cloak of tradition or religion, far from the eyes of wider society. What made Martha Holloway Freeman remarkable was her determination not only to escape the cycle of consanguineous abuse but to turn her experience into a force for positive change. Her courage in confronting not only her father but an entire system of beliefs and practices transmitted for generations created waves that would eventually help shape more rigorous child protection policies and greater awareness of the dangers of extreme isolation. Hope Freeman grew up unaware of the complete details of her conception until adulthood, when Martha finally shared the full story. When questioned later about how she received the revelation, Hope responded with the quiet wisdom that characterized her relationship with her extraordinary mother. The story of how I came into the world is not my story. It is her story, her courage and her determination. My story began when she decided that the past would not define the future. The blood that runs in my veins may carry the genetic legacy of generations of wrong choices, but it also carries the legacy of a woman who had the courage to say no more and start a new chapter. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. This real story reveals how isolated communities have hidden crimes for generations, and only by knowing these secrets can we prevent them from repeating in our own backyard. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Be sure to leave your like so that more people learn about this impressive case that happened in the Ozark Mountains, and share it with someone who appreciates stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history. Remember, knowing the past is the only way to ensure these cycles do not repeat in the future. Martha's courage is a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there is always a path to the light.